Welcome to Candlewick Library. I'm Cheryl, and today I'm doing my November wrap-up. I tried to take part in quite a few readathons in November. There was Historathon, there was Nonfiction November, there was the C.S. Lewis readathon, and then I really wanted to do the Moore Montgomery challenge as well. Spoiler alert, that one I did not get to. I didn't read any Lucy Montgomery in November, unfortunately. As far as the other three challenges went, I did all of the books that I planned for Nonfiction November and most of the books that I planned for Historathon. So I read quite a few books, and I read a lot of really good books in November. So I'm going to get right to those. First, I'm going to talk about the books that I read for Historathon. After starting the Timeless series a few months ago, I really wanted to get to the next two books and then the new one that was coming out. And so I read In This Moment, For a Lifetime, and Across the Ages, all in November. I used In This Moment as a book that had a famous historical character in the book because really I could have used any of the Timeless books for that. They usually have somebody from history in them. I really enjoyed this book. I have not disliked any of the books in this series yet, but I feel like I keep liking the next one better than the one before. And so in this one, she has actually 3 time periods to choose from. And there was a part in this book that shocked me. I cannot stop recommending this series because a lot of times when books in this genre get so much hype, I have found that a lot of times I'm disappointed by them when I read them. And this series I have not been. And then I used For a Lifetime for the out of my normal time period because one of the storylines was in the Salem witch trial time. And I read some from that, but I don't read a lot from that time period. I also ended up using it for historical nonfiction hybrid because it has real events in it as well. Originally, I planned on using a different book for that, but I did not get to it until December. And then I read Across the Ages. This is the newest one. I read this one for the historical romance prompt, and this has been my favorite one so far. I have given all the other books about 4.5+ stars, and this one was my first 5-star in the series. I don't even know exactly how to put into words why I liked this one the most so far, but I just felt so connected. I feel so connected to the characters in all of the books, but in this one even more so, and I just really, really loved this book. It also had one of my favorite characters in all 4 of these books so far. I don't know if I should say who, in case that spoils somebody when they're reading it. Maybe you could try to guess. If you've read this book, in the comments, try to guess who my favorite character is. And then I mentioned that my oldest daughter really enjoys the Culper Spy Ring books by Rosanna M. White, and I originally had bought them for myself, but she likes them so much that I've let her keep them. But I had not read book 2 and 3 yet, and so I promised her I would get to these in November so I could finally give them back to her. And in the first book, it follows spies in the Revolutionary War. And I really thought when I first bought the series that they were all going to be in that time period, but they actually aren't. Book 2 is in the War of 1812 and book 3 is during the Civil War. And so there's different spy elements in each of those time periods. And I used book 2, Whispers from the Shadows, for the war and or conflict prompt. So that's obvious since it takes place during the War of 1812. And then I used book 3, Circle of Spies, for the social issues, cultural perspectives. And that ended up working out really well since this was during the Civil War. And so there was a lot of talk about racial issues and North versus South and even other issues besides the slavery in the South, and then a few other just societal norm types of issues that would kind of be spoilers. So these I really enjoyed as well. For the adapted to film prompt, I used We Were the Lucky Ones. However, this one isn't really this isn't fiction. It's based on Georgia Hunter's real family, as she has an author note in the back that talks about how she found out about her family's history, and so then she wrote this book about them. I decided to use it anyway, even though it isn't fiction, because it is fictionalized. There probably are things in it that aren't completely accurate because she's basing it on family stories and different things, but she's writing it out into novel form. And so I would imagine that she's had to take some creative liberties with the story in some areas. And I buddy read this with Alma from Alma's Book Journey, and I had watched the mini-series with my husband, and so when I found out that it was a real story, I did not know that when I was watching it, and so afterward, when I found out it was a real story, I wanted to get the book and read it. She had not seen it yet, so she was reading the book first, and so she said that she's partway through the miniseries, and on one of her videos recently, she said that she liked the book better. And I found that I liked the miniseries better, but only because I already knew the story so well, because the adaptation is so good. The adaptation is so true to the book. And so since I already knew the story, I don't think it was as dramatic for me as it would have been for Alma reading the book as the first time she read the story. So I would recommend reading the book first so that you get that emotional response from the book before already knowing the story and being able to see it from the miniseries, because I did see the characters as the people in the show. And I also would note that, there is swearing. There is swearing in this and in the show that I normally wouldn't want to read in books. And there are some scenes in the show that I thought maybe were a little bit inappropriate. However, they ended up being from the book. There was nothing. I don't think there was anything in the show that was inappropriate that wasn't in the actual story. And I thought when I watched it that maybe they had added some things. So I don't think that the book or the show is for everyone, but I do think that sometimes with things like that, the books are easier to read than seeing something on a screen. For this kind of story, I tend to be a little bit more loose with the things that I am okay with, because it's real people's story. It's real things that happened and the dramatic nature of the situations people are put in. And so the swearing doesn't bother me as much. I've said this before, in nonfiction or in things that are war, because it feels more realistic. It doesn't feel gratuitous. So I don't know if those things were gratuitous in her writing or if they were real events that she knew for sure happened. I did really enjoy this, and I had fun reading that with Alma. And then the last book I used for Historathon was Christmas at Sugar Plum Manor. This is also by Rosanna M. White. This is the book I picked for my mom and I to read together for our Inklings group for November. And then we'll get together this month in December to talk about it. And this was a novella, but it was a little bit longer than a lot of the other novellas I've read. It was 188 pages, so I feel like this could just be considered a normal book. I'm not quite sure at how many pages people decide to make something a novella, because I've read plenty of books that were less than that I didn't even think were. As far as the story, I still think this is one of the most beautiful covers I own, and I liked the story a lot. I enjoyed the characters. I was a little disappointed though. And the reason is because I thought that this was a Nutcracker retelling, and it was not. So there's inspiration from the Nutcracker in it, and there might be some elements of inspiration from the Nutcracker that I missed. It's been a while since I read the Nutcracker, but they do a play in the book that is the Nutcracker. And it's as if one of the characters in the book wrote it instead of the actual author. And so that was, to me, that and only a couple of other little things were Nutcracker related. And so while I still really enjoyed it, that did affect my reading because it wasn't what I expected. So I would say go into this knowing that it has Nutcracker inspiration, but it is not a Nutcracker retelling. I also didn't feel like the writing was as strong as some of her other books, including those spy books. As far as nonfiction November, there was 4 prompts for that this year, and they were one-word prompts that you could interpret in any number of ways that you wanted to. And number 1 was code. And I have been reading this book for a couple of months, Chaos, Charles Manson, the CIA, and the Secret History of the 60s by Tom O'Neill. I put it down for a couple of months because this was a pretty hard book to read sometimes. It was just very heavy. And so I put it down, but I picked it back up in November knowing that I wanted to finish it, and I did. And this was really good. It was very interesting. It led to a lot of conversations with me and my parents, with my husband, and I thought about it a lot when I wasn't reading it. You start out the book with the Manson family murders that are the most well known, and then the rest of the book is spent telling us about the research that this writer did into Charles Manson and into the mind control and all of the different things happening in this area of California in the 60s. And it brought in MK Ultra, it brought in using drugs to control people's minds, brought in the CIA, and there was just so many interesting things in here that make you question just about everything that you can in that area. I was a little disappointed that there is no real resolution to it. You don't know for sure that this person or this person or this person did this particular thing. It's mainly like, here are all the facts, but none of them can be known for sure, because the only people that could really tell you the absolute truth about it either aren't talking or are dead. So I felt like it left me with more questions, but it also was very interesting. This also is something I wouldn't recommend to everyone. It has a lot of violence. There is swearing. I'm not going to actually keep the book because I know I'm not going to read it again. And so I'm going to probably take this to a little free library or something. But I do think that if you are interested in any of those things I talked about, you would probably get a lot out of this book. He's a good writer. He definitely put so much time and research into this. I learned things I'd never heard before that are backed up. I mean, these aren't just opinions of his. It's facts. You just have to kind of figure out how they all connect. I would recommend it if you're interested. I wouldn't recommend it if you're not and don't want to read those violent accounts and some of the swearing. The number 2 was Path. And I couldn't remember, I think when I made my video for what I wanted to read in November, I couldn't remember why I had chosen this book for that. But it was because I was doing my British literature course, and this was the next book on the path to finishing that. And that was Are Women Human by Dorothy Sayers. And this had that essay and then another essay in it. So obviously very short book. And I really enjoyed the essay. I thought it was very interesting, very thought-provoking, and it did make me want to read more from her. Number 3 was Shot, and I used We Were the Lucky Ones for that as well, for obvious reasons. There was a lot of shooting going on in that book. Number 4 is Join, and for that I used Mere Christianity because C.S. Lewis joined Christianity. And this was a reread. It had been a very long time since I've read this book, and I really enjoyed reading it again. It surprised me how much I liked it the first time I read it, since my theological views were so different, and there were so many things in here that were opposite to what I used to believe. When I read it the first time, I never saw those things and thought, oh, that doesn't sound like us. But this time I could read it and be like, yes, that is what I believe now. As usual, he's such a good writer, and everything I think that he puts out is just thought-provoking. And then speaking of C.S. Lewis, for the C.S. Lewis readathon, the prompts were Narnia, which was a middle grade or fantasy, and I did not get to one of those. Mere Christianity, the Christian nonfiction, I used Mere Christianity for that. The Space Trilogy, a sci-fi, I did not get to that. Till We Have Faces, a female main character, I used In This Moment for that. The Screwtape Letters, The Spiritual Warfare or Epistolary, I did not read that. The Four Loves, by a book by a different member of the Inklings. She had said that Dorothy Sayers could count, so I used Are Women Human? And The Discarded Image inspired Lewis. I used the Bible for that. I did finish up my second full reading of the Bible in November. And so I used that. And obviously, I did not read the whole thing in November, but I had been reading it over this year and finished it. And then for The Great Divorce, A Stubborn Character, I used For a Lifetime. And then I did not get the Christian biography done in November. I had to push the book I wanted to use for that to December. Then, like I said, I did not read any for the Moore Montgomery Challenge. There were 3 other books that I finished right at the end of November. They were 3 more in the British literature course. I was supposed to read Lord Jim by Joseph Conrad, but when I picked this up at the used bookstore, they also had Heart of Darkness. And so I ended up getting both of them. I'm not sure that Joseph Conrad's writing style is very appealing to me. I had a hard time getting into both books, but I would say that I actually enjoyed Heart of Darkness more. With Lord Jim, I found that sometimes I would just drift off and my mind was somewhere else while I was reading, and then I would go back, and so I would have to just really focus myself when I was reading so that I didn't keep wandering. And eventually I got to about, I'm not even sure where it was. It's a certain part I got to, I started just skimming, and I skimmed for a while and then read at the end again because I wanted to be done with it. And I didn't want to completely DNF it, but I was bored with it. And so that one was not a win for me. But Heart of Darkness I thought was interesting. I also did not enjoy reading it necessarily, but I thought it was interesting. So I'm not sure that I will ever read anything else by him. That might be my entire Joseph Conrad experience. And then I read The Mayor of Casterbridge by Thomas Hardy. And I also thought this book was really interesting. I didn't like it as much as the one other book I've read by him so far has been Far from the Madding Crowd, but I still did like it. It made me think a lot. It had a lot of plot twists, misunderstandings, but it had a pretty sad ending. And I found that there were a lot more layers to it, that as I thought about it more than I could see and I could appreciate. But while reading it, there were a few times when I got kind of frustrated with the characters and wished things were a little bit different. But it was a very interesting book, and I am glad I read that. So that's it. I got quite a lot of books read in November. As far as my favorite book of November, it was Across the Ages. Like I said, absolutely love that book. So I would love to know if any of you also read that book in November, since it just came out, and what your favorite book of November was.